The scent of coffee and warm pastries filled the air, but something felt off. Barack Obama sat in a quiet corner, observing as a black family entered the diner, their laughter light and unbothered. But as they approached the hostess stand, the energy shifted. Karen, the waitress, forced a tight smile and gestured toward a dimly lit table in the back, far from the windows, far from the lively atmosphere. The family didn't notice, but Obama did. The room held its breath. Would he stay silent, or was this moment about to take a turn no one expected? Have you ever witnessed something that didn't sit right? What would you do? Comment. Where you're watching from, like and subscribe for more powerful stories. The diner was a small, cozy place, a local spot where the checkered floors, worn and polished from years of use, and the soft lighting cast a warm, inviting glow that seemed to embrace you as soon as you walked in. The combination of rustic decor and a low hum of chatter from regulars made it feel like a home away from home, a refuge where locals gathered to catch up over a cup of coffee or a hearty meal. The clatter of dishes, the soft scraping of chairs, and the familiar sounds of laughter filled the air, weaving together in a steady, comforting rhythm. It was a place where people could momentarily escape the outside world and lose themselves in the comfort of good food and familiar faces. But underneath the surface of this quaint, seemingly peaceful diner, something darker was stirring, waiting to emerge. From the outside, the diner appeared to be a simple, peaceful establishment. Nothing more than a typical, everyday gathering spot where people from all walks of life could come together. A place where the community met over shared meals, exchanging stories and enjoying the camaraderie that comes with the familiarity of a local eatery. It was easy to see why this place felt like a safe haven for so many. The large windows revealed a sleepy, quiet town where life moved at a comfortable pace, where the pressures of the outside world could be momentarily forgotten. But just beyond the cheerful hum of daily life, there was a subtle undercurrent of unease, a quiet, insidious divide that no one seemed willing to address or acknowledge. The waitstaff, seasoned and efficient, moved briskly between tables, their movements practiced and fluid. They served customers with the kind of well-rehearsed politeness that was expected in such establishments. Their faces, smiling and welcoming on the surface, masked the underlying weariness of those who had seen it all, the smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, the routine that had long since become automatic. Each interaction, while courteous, was steeped in the same predictable formality that kept things moving smoothly, hiding the simmering tension just below the surface. But despite the rhythmic pace of the diner, with its predictable ebb and flow, a deeper, more insidious tension was beginning to take root, unnoticed by many. Then, the black family entered the diner, carrying with them an air of quiet expectation. They were just another family, another group of people looking to enjoy a meal in peace. But as they stepped inside, they unknowingly crossed into a storm of prejudice, quietly brewing just out of sight. The warm greeting of the hostess felt like a formality, her words polite but empty as she directed them to a table far removed from the cozy booths where the more favored patrons sat. Though the family didn't yet recognize it, they were already the subject of an invisible growing tension, one that had nothing to do with their presence but everything to do with the subtle prejudices that lingered in the air, unnoticed by most. At this point, nothing overtly confrontational had yet occurred. No words had been spoken, no insults hurled. Yet the tension in the air was undeniable. It was subtle, like a low hum you can feel but can't quite identify, growing stronger with each passing moment. The family, unaware of the dynamic at play, settled into their seats, their unease growing by the second as they noticed the slight differences in how they were being treated. They tried to brush it off, to dismiss the quiet discomfort that crept in, but it was becoming harder to ignore. Something was off. Something was wrong. The once welcoming warmth of the diner had started to feel colder, more distant, and no one could have predicted how quickly this seemingly innocent visit would become the setting for an encounter that would expose the deeper, more painful truths that lay just beneath the surface of this small town. In the far corner of the diner, Barack Obama sat alone, his presence almost unnoticed by the rest of the room. His calm demeanor, almost too serene for the circumstances unfolding around him, contrasted sharply with the brewing tension. It was as though he could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that something was about to happen, but unsure whether it was his place to intervene. The former president, a man whose very identity had been shaped by battles for racial justice, sat quietly. He had seen firsthand the injustice that permeated society, but today he was not here to fight. He was just another diner in a quiet corner, observing. Yet even as he sipped his coffee, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling of responsibility. A part of him knew that remaining passive would be easier, perhaps even safer. But another part of him wondered whether silence would betray those who needed a voice in that very moment. Obama's internal struggle was palpable. Should he step in or stay silent? His thoughts echoed the difficult choices so many face in the face of injustice. Karen, the waitress, wore a smile that was just a little too tight, her voice sweet but lacking warmth. She greeted the black family with the same cheerful tone she used with every other customer, but her actions told a different story. She led them to a table at the back of the diner, tucked away in a dim corner far from the windows, while empty, better-situated tables sat unoccupied near the front. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Her comments, sprinkled with the thin veneer of politeness, were also a telltale sign of the subtle prejudices that shaped her behavior. "It's a little quieter back here," she said, as though that alone justified the family being seated away from the lively, more visible parts of the restaurant. The black family smiled politely, unaware of the underlying message in Karen's words, but something in the air felt off. It was in her tone, her distracted attention, and the barely concealed discomfort she exuded in their presence. Karen's acts of neglect, though not overt, chipped away at the family's dignity, leaving them to wonder, without fully understanding why, if they were being treated differently. The other patrons in the diner, once a vibrant mix of locals, now seemed strangely distant. Some were absorbed in their meals, their attention locked on the food in front of them, oblivious to the growing tension at the back of the room. Their conversations continued without pause, as if nothing was amiss. They could feel the atmosphere shift, but chose not to acknowledge it, hiding behind the routine comforts of their own lives. Others, however, noticed the quiet injustice unfolding, their eyes flicking nervously to the black family seated at the back, their discomfort palpable. But much like the others, they did nothing. The room had become a quiet stage for a drama that no one seemed willing to confront. The lack of intervention was telling. Each silent glance, each averted gaze spoke louder than any words could. The room, for all its noise, was drowning in silence, a silence that grew heavier with every passing moment. It was the kind of silence that allowed prejudice to persist unchecked in the face of injustice, and in that silence, each observer had chosen their side, whether they realized it or not. Do you think people who are silently complicit in racism are just as responsible as the perpetrators? How do you feel about those who stand by and watch, not speaking out against injustice? Is silence in some ways a form of support for the harmful systems at play? Why or why not? As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the diner continued to grow, though it remained hidden beneath the surface like a slow burn. Karen, the waitress, moved from table to table, her movements smooth and practiced. She chatted with the white couple seated just a few feet away from the black family, her voice light and friendly as she offered them extra napkins and refilled their coffee cups with a smile that seemed to last just a little too long. The couple laughed along with her, clearly enjoying the attention. Meanwhile, the black family, who had been quietly seated in the back corner, watched as Karen passed by them repeatedly. Every time they raised their hands for her attention, their requests were met with terse responses, brief, dismissive, almost mechanical. When the father politely asked for more water, Karen merely nodded, barely making eye contact, and walked away. No offer of extra napkins or refills for them, no friendly conversation. And yet, as Karen moved back and forth between the tables, her tone shifted noticeably when addressing the black family. What had been polite and professional at first was now laced with something colder, something harder. Her forced cheerfulness, when she did speak to them, sounded more like an obligation than genuine hospitality. With each passing moment, her comments became increasingly uncomfortable. The challenges of dealing with people who don't appreciate good service, she remarked, clearly meant to be a casual joke. But to the black family, it felt less like a joke and more like an insult, a subtle insinuation of their worth. Each small act of neglect piled on top of the other, and the family grew visibly uneasy. The quiet discomfort of being ignored morphed into something deeper, something unsettling. The air in the diner, once light and untroubled, began to feel heavy with unspoken judgment. Obama's eyes shifted from the black family to Karen and back again. The contrast between the two, Karen's seemingly indifferent expression and the subtle but growing discomfort on the black family's faces, struck him like a jolt of electricity. The family sat at their table, trying to carry on with their meal, but their unease was palpable, impossible to ignore. Obama could see it in their body language, the small glances they exchanged, the way they subtly shifted in their seats. They were trying to make sense of what was happening, but were unsure of how to address it. His own thoughts became a storm of uncertainty as he continued to watch the scene unfold. He had been in countless situations where injustice was at the forefront, whether it was through legislation, protests, or public speaking engagements. He had stood before crowds as a leader, a symbol of change, and had always known exactly what needed to be done. His actions were clear, his purpose unwavering. But here, in this small, quiet diner, something felt different. The stakes weren't as clear-cut as they had been on the public stage, where he had the power of his office and the support of thousands behind him. In this intimate, private setting, his influence felt smaller, more personal, and somehow that made the weight of his decision even heavier. This time, Obama wasn't just a figurehead of a movement. He was a man, a private citizen, seated in a booth in a local diner, observing a situation where racial bias was playing out in the most subtle, insidious ways. It wasn't the kind of racism that demanded an obvious confrontation. It was quieter, more insidious, the kind that hides in everyday interactions and is easy to ignore. It was the kind of racism that could slip under the radar of most people in the room. But Obama saw it, and it gnawed at him, pulling at his sense of right and wrong. He was the only one who seemed to notice the deeper currents at play. His internal conflict began to stir as he weighed the decision before him. Should he stand up now, break the silence, and call out Karen's behavior? Or should he stay silent, allowing the moment to pass, trusting that someone else would speak up? But by intervening, Obama wondered if he would be drawing unnecessary attention to an issue that most of the people around him seemed willing to ignore. Would his involvement change anything, or would it just exacerbate the situation, making it even harder for the black family to feel comfortable in a place where they were already unwelcome? His mind raced through every possibility, every consequence. He had fought for justice on the grand stage, with the eyes of the world upon him, but now here, in this diner, he was just another patron, another person witnessing the quiet injustice of the world. What kind of message would it send if he stepped in? Would it undermine the dignity of the family if he spoke for them? Would his words somehow diminish their own strength, their ability to stand up for themselves? The last thing Obama wanted to do was take away their voice. They were there to speak for themselves, to take control of the situation. But at the same time, how could he remain silent when he saw the harm being done right before him? How could he allow the status quo to continue when it was so evident that the black family was being unfairly treated, not because of anything they had done, but because of something they had no control over, simply their race? Obama's struggle was not just his own. It was a dilemma faced by many when confronted with systemic racism: to remain passive, hoping someone else will speak out, or to act and risk being seen as stirring trouble. Even the most powerful individuals, those with years of experience in confronting injustice, could feel the weight of such decisions. In this moment, Obama felt the burden of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like never before. He wasn't just considering his own actions. He was considering how his decision would impact the family, the community, and the broader struggle for justice. He understood how deeply personal and fraught with consequence each act of intervention could be. It was a choice between stepping into the fray, risking backlash, and remaining silent in the face of something he knew was wrong. But in that small moment of indecision, Obama also understood the true cost of silence. He knew that, in some ways, silence itself was a form of complicity. How could he not speak out when he knew that the lack of action would only allow the injustice to continue? The pressure of the decision mounted with every passing second, but deep down, Obama knew that if he didn't act now, he might never be able to live with himself. As Karen's behavior became more overt, the black family grew increasingly upset. The father tried again to make eye contact with the waitress, hoping for some acknowledgement, some sign that she recognized their presence. But Karen seemed entirely focused on the white couple next to them. She laughed with them, served them extra napkins, even joked about the weather, all the while ignoring the black family's quiet, growing frustration. The father's face tightened in a quiet resolve as he whispered to his wife, his voice barely audible above the hum of the diner. "This isn't right," he murmured. "Can you feel it?" His wife nodded, her brow furrowed, unsure of how to respond, but feeling the sting of the unfairness. Their children sat silently, confused by the lack of attention. Their small faces, full of innocence, were clouded by a strange discomfort they couldn't quite explain. Why weren't they being treated the same as everyone else? The whole situation was beginning to unsettle them, and it was evident in their restless glances toward their parents, who were doing their best to maintain composure. The atmosphere in the diner thickened. At first, the other patrons had been unaware or indifferent to the growing tension, but now some of them had started to notice the disparity in service. A few glanced nervously at the black family, their eyes darting away quickly as if afraid to be caught looking. Their unease was palpable, but they did nothing. They were either unwilling or unable to confront the discomfort in the air. A few exchanged quiet glances, their faces betraying their understanding of what was happening, but no one moved to intervene. The silence was deafening. Obama, too, felt the weight of the moment settle over him. His gaze flicked between the black family and the other patrons, and he realized something that unsettled him even more. The silence in the room was a response in itself. It spoke volumes about the deeper societal issues at play. The very inaction in this small space reflected a larger, more pervasive unwillingness to confront injustice. Karen's actions had poisoned the atmosphere, creating a toxic environment. where discomfort and uncertainty grew with each passing minute. It was a standoff. The family's sense of injustice deepened with every glance they received, every moment that passed without anyone speaking out. The tension was unbearable, yet no one moved, no one spoke up. The room was holding its breath, and so were they. As Obama observed the family, a raw emotional weight settled over him. This wasn't just about a single interaction between a waitress and a family. It was a painful manifestation of something much deeper, a manifestation that he had seen so many times before in various forms. He had witnessed the quiet cruelty of prejudice throughout his career, but there was something particularly devastating about the subtlety of what was happening right before him. The systemic nature of racism was on full display. There were no overt insults, no public slurs, but the actions of Karen and the cold reception that the black family received were just as harmful, if not more so. Obama could feel the sting of the moment. Every glance from Karen, every dismissive gesture as she passed by without even meeting the family's eyes, was a painful reminder of the systemic inequalities that continued to thrive in every corner of society. This wasn't just a one-time incident. It was a moment rooted in years, decades, even centuries of racial injustice. For the black family, this experience would stay with them long after they left the diner. The quiet humiliation of being ignored and treated as invisible would linger in their minds, eroding their sense of worth. They might not fully understand it in that moment, but they would feel the impact of it as they walked out those doors, an experience that would echo for years, adding to the weight of every similar moment they had endured. For Obama, it was an all-too-familiar reminder of the ongoing battle for equality, the exhaustion of knowing that this type of prejudice still existed, that it had never truly gone away, was suffocating. His inner turmoil was evident, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on his chest. How could he address something so ingrained, so deeply rooted in the social structures that shaped this world? How could he change something so vast and pervasive with just a few words or actions? In this small, seemingly insignificant diner, he wasn't just watching this injustice unfold. He was witnessing the lived reality of it, his own reality and the reality of millions of others who faced the same struggles daily. The emotional intensity of the moment grew, and Obama felt the crushing weight of being part of a system that often failed to act when it was needed the most. His gaze swept the room, but no one else had moved. The patrons, the waitstaff, even the family, they were all locked in their own moments of discomfort, but they were also part of the same system, the same silence that allowed racism to persist unchallenged. The pain of systemic racism had never been more undeniable. It was in the looks, the gestures, the words left unsaid. It was in the weight of the silence in the room, a silence that no one dared break. The moment was charged with a sense of urgency, with the reality that this issue, this injustice, couldn't wait any longer to be addressed. Yet as the seconds ticked by, no one stepped forward, and Obama, despite his inner conflict, felt the weight of the decision pressing harder on him with each passing moment. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly in a situation that felt uncomfortable or wrong? How did you respond in that moment? Did you speak up or did you remain silent, unsure of how to act? What emotions did you experience as you watched someone endure injustice, and what do you think you could have done differently? The tension in the diner had been building steadily, like a pot on the stove, until it finally boiled over. Karen, the waitress, had reached her tipping point, and so had the black family. She approached their table once more, her smile so forced it was almost painful to watch. "I'm afraid we don't have any tables available in the main section," she said, her voice cold and detached, not a hint of warmth in her tone. As she gestured toward the back, where the cramped table sat, the subtle dismissal was unmistakable. "But this table should be fine," she added, though it was clear she didn't care for their comfort. The Black family exchanged uneasy looks. There was no mistaking what was happening now. The father's jaw tightened as he looked at his wife. His fingers clenched into fists under the table, a sign of the simmering frustration that had been building for so long. His wife shifted uncomfortably, a slight shake of her head betraying her disbelief at how blatantly they were being treated as less than. This wasn't just poor service. It wasn't just an oversight. It was deliberate. It was clear they were being made to feel unwelcome in the very place they had come to enjoy a meal, to be seen as equal. The Black family's quiet frustration finally gave way to open anger, and the father, in a low but firm voice, addressed Karen. "Is there a reason we're being seated here?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension in the air. But Karen, unfazed, simply shrugged and moved away. "Enjoy your meal," she said flatly, as though the words held no real meaning. From his corner of the diner, Obama had been watching the entire exchange unfold. His internal conflict had been growing with every passing moment, but now, seeing the family so visibly upset, the injustice was undeniable. It was too much to ignore. The quiet anger in the father's eyes, the hopelessness in the mother's, the discomfort in their children's faces, it all hit him hard. Obama stood up. He couldn't sit idly by anymore. This moment, this injustice, needed to be confronted. It was time to act. The room seemed to hold its breath as Obama rose from his seat, the soft rustling of his chair cutting through the tension. Like a knife, the quiet hum of the diner, once filled with the clatter of silverware and low murmurs, fell into a heavy silence. Every eye in the room turned toward him, sensing that something was about to shift. Obama's posture had changed, his body now radiating an unmistakable authority that hadn't been there moments before. The calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the escalating tension in the diner was now replaced by a quiet strength. It was as though he was no longer just a witness. He was a man called to act. His steps were slow but deliberate as he moved toward the Black family's table, his eyes never leaving Karen. His voice broke the stillness, firm and steady, as though he had been waiting for this very moment to speak the truth. "What you just did is not just a mistake," Obama said, his tone unwavering, as he looked directly at Karen. "It's a reflection of something much deeper, something that affects all of us." His gaze never faltered as he spoke, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "This isn't just about a table, it's about a system that fails to see the humanity in people who don't look like you." The power of his words hung in the air, as though the entire room had paused, absorbing the weight of what he was saying. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her previous smugness now replaced by an uneasy defensiveness. She stammered, attempting to deflect, but the words escaped, her powerless in the face of Obama's quiet, unwavering strength. I didn't mean it like that," she muttered, but it was clear her excuses were hollow. She had no defense against the truth. The room, once filled with the clinking of silverware and muffled conversations, now felt eerily still. Every eye was locked on Obama, waiting for the next move. And Obama, in that moment, knew that his words were not just for Karen, they were for everyone present. They were a challenge, a call to recognize the injustices that ran deeper than any single act. As Obama's gaze remained fixed on Karen, he didn't just see a waitress in that moment. He saw the reflection of a broader problem, one that everyone, in the room, consciously or unconsciously, had been a part of. The room seemed to exhale in unison, the emotional intensity of the moment washing over them. The raw power of truth stood in stark contrast to the denial that had lingered in the air just moments before. And as Obama held Karen's gaze, the weight of the moment became overwhelming. This was more than just a confrontation. This was a reckoning. The energy in the room shifted, thick with tension, as Obama's words echoed through the diner. The words hung in the air, charged with a power that seemed to reverberate beyond the walls of the restaurant. As he spoke, he cut through Karen's excuses with a quiet authority, addressing not just her actions, but the systemic issues that had allowed them to fester unnoticed for so long. What happened here today goes beyond a single act of bias, Obama said, his voice rising just slightly, filling the space with the weight of his conviction. It's a reflection of how people's prejudices, often unspoken, have been allowed to fester in every corner of society. His gaze moved across the room, ensuring that everyone present felt the gravity of his words. This isn't about you and me, Karen. This is about the generations of people who have had to fight for their dignity every day. This is about a system that treats some as less than, simply because of how they look. The impact of his words was immediate, like a heavy stone thrown into still water, causing ripples of realization that spread outward. Karen's defensive posture faltered almost imperceptibly. The smug expression that had once been etched onto her face shifted, replaced by a subtle but unmistakable look of guilt. She opened her mouth, but the words failed her, as if she suddenly understood just how deep the problem was. Her earlier excuses fell away, leaving her speechless, her attempt to defend herself now clearly inadequate in the face of the truth Obama had just laid bare. Around them, the other patrons began to shift in their seats. Some glanced down, others exchanged uncertain looks, but all were affected. The truth had begun to sink in, and for the first time in that room, it felt impossible to ignore. The quiet hum of the diner had gone silent, replaced by a tension that was too thick to cut through. People who had been passive observers just moments ago now felt the uncomfortable weight of the moment settle on their shoulders. Obama wasn't just confronting Karen anymore. He was challenging the very system that had allowed this behavior to exist without question, without challenge. His confrontation was not just an attack on an individual, it was a call to confront the broader societal structures that allowed racism to thrive unnoticed in everyday life. His words carried the weight of centuries of struggle, of battles fought by those who had been denied the dignity that should have been their right. The silence in the room deepened, becoming almost suffocating. No one spoke, no one moved. Everyone was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth of what was happening. They could no longer look away. They could no longer pretend they didn't see the systemic issues that had been right in front of them the entire time. Obama had called them all out, not just Karen, but everyone who had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. And in that moment, no one could deny it. The room was charged with a raw, unspoken realization, and the weight of it was unbearable. In a moment of profound change, the black family, who had remained passive observers of their treatment until now, found their collective voice. It was as if, in that instant, a switch had been flipped. A quiet, simmering frustration that had built throughout the entire meal now erupted into a powerful stand. They rose together, their movements synchronized, as though they were all suddenly bound by a shared sense of purpose and strength. The father, who had been so composed up until now, his hands clenched tightly in frustration, stepped forward. His posture was different, strong, unyielding. His voice, once unsure and filled with hesitation, now rang with clarity and authority, echoing through the stillness of the diner. "We're not asking for special treatment," he said, each word carrying the weight of generations of silent suffering. "We're asking for respect. We deserve to be treated with the same dignity as anyone else in this diner." The words landed like a thunderclap, rattling the air and drawing attention from every corner of the room. There was no mistaking the power in his voice, the strength that came from the decades of oppression he and others like him had endured. The mother, standing tall beside him, added her own firm declaration. We're not going to let this moment define us, but we will not allow you to diminish our worth, not today." She stood like a pillar of resilience, her words cutting through the lingering tension in the room. Her face was a picture of quiet defiance, a mother unwilling to allow her children to grow up in a world where their humanity could be dismissed so easily. For the first time, the children, who had been sitting quietly, unsure of how to react, also found their voice. They nodded, in agreement, their eyes wide with newfound pride. The younger ones, who had been confused by the unspoken dynamics of the situation, now understood what was happening in a way that their tender ages had not allowed before. In that moment, they saw their parents as not just protectors, but as warriors for their dignity. The power dynamic in the room shifted dramatically. The Black family's frustration, which had once been muted by social norms and a deep-rooted discomfort with challenging authority, now surged forward in a wave of collective strength. The room that had once felt suffocating with silence now buzzed with a different energy, one of unity and empowerment. Their courage sparked something in the other patrons, who had been either too afraid or too indifferent to act up until now. A murmur spread through the room, a soft but steady chorus of support for the family. People who had once avoided eye contact now began to nod, to speak in hushed tones of agreement. The quiet voices of solidarity grew louder. The collective mood had shifted from one of passive acceptance to a powerful call for justice. Karen, the waitress, stood frozen, her face pale with guilt. The arrogance that had once defined her movements and words had disappeared, replaced by the stark realization of the gravity of her actions. Her earlier confidence was shattered. She no longer had the power to dismiss the family or ignore their humanity. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was pregnant with possibility, with the sense that something was changing in the very air around them. In that moment, the Black family had not only reclaimed their dignity, but had also ignited a spark of resistance in everyone around them. It was clear that this wasn't just a moment of personal empowerment for them. It was a small victory, one that had the potential to ripple outward, challenging the norms and injustices that had allowed Karen's behavior to go unchecked for so long. The weight of the room had shifted, and it felt like a turning point, a moment where people could no longer turn a blind eye to the quiet injustices that had been allowed to fester. When was the last time you witnessed a moment of transformation, where those who were once passive found the courage and strength to speak out against injustice? What did it feel like to see someone rise up, to challenge the silence, and to stand up for what was right? How did that moment change you? And what can we learn from those who decide to take action when the stakes are high? The diner sat in a thick, oppressive silence, the kind that hangs in the air long after an emotional storm has passed. The once vibrant hum of clinking silverware and quiet conversation had ceased, replaced by a stillness that seemed to echo throughout the room. The air, which had been so full of tension just moments ago, now felt heavy with reflection and uncertainty. Patrons remained seated, unsure of how to react or what to say. The weight of what had just transpired lingered, settling over everyone like a blanket. Karen, the waitress, stood behind the counter, her face flushed with a deep shade of red that only heightened the discomfort that surrounded her. Her wide eyes reflected a mix of guilt, disbelief, and shame. She had expected to get through the day without a hitch, continuing her work with little more than polite smiles and neutral exchanges. Instead, she had found herself at the center of a public reckoning, her actions laid bare for all to see. Obama's words had cut through her defenses, exposing her biases and leaving her reeling. She had never thought of herself as prejudiced, but now, standing there, it was impossible to deny the reality of what had just happened. The diner's owner, who had witnessed the entire scene, moved quickly to address the situation. Karen was let go immediately. It was a decision made without hesitation. Her behavior had gone too far, and the community would not tolerate such treatment, especially in a place meant to be a gathering spot for all people. But even as Karen was escorted out, there was a conversation happening among the patrons, an unexpected development in an otherwise uncomfortable moment. Some of the diners, who had been passive observers up until that point, suggested that Karen be given a chance for redemption. They advocated for her to undergo counseling or sensitivity training to confront the biases that had shaped her behavior and hopefully grow as an individual. There was a belief that this moment could serve as an opportunity for learning, both for Karen and for the community as a whole. It was an attempt to balance accountability with compassion, to remind everyone that growth and change were still possible, even after a mistake as significant as this one. But for Karen, that moment of potential growth was overshadowed by the realization that she had allowed her biases to take control, and in doing so, had hurt others. The suggestion of training or counseling seemed like a small chance to make amends, but it came with the undeniable truth that she had failed those she was supposed to serve. It wasn't just a bad day at work, it was a failure to uphold the most basic tenets of human dignity and respect. Meanwhile, the black family, who had been at the center of the storm, sat quietly. Their strength was evident, not just in their actions during the confrontation, but in the way they carried themselves now. They had come to the diner to enjoy a simple meal, but they had left with something far more valuable: their dignity. Obama's intervention had been crucial, but the family's own courage had played an equally important role. They had spoken out in the face of injustice, and their voices had been heard. The power dynamic had shifted in that room, and while the family was still processing everything that had happened, there was a quiet sense of victory in their hearts. But the sense of closure was bittersweet. For them, justice had been served. But it wasn't just Karen they were confronting. It was the system that allowed people like her to operate with impunity. Karen's behavior was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something much larger, a societal structure that allowed biases to fester unchecked. For the black family, this moment of triumph was tempered by the knowledge that this was one battle in a much larger war. They had won this fight, but they knew there were many more to come. And for every victory, there would still be 1,000 moments where silence would need to be broken and courage would need to be found. For the rest of the diner, the feeling of relief was mixed with a more uncomfortable reflection. Some were relieved that the situation had been addressed, but others were left grappling with the larger question: how had this been allowed to go on for so long? How had Karen's behavior been tolerated for so many years, unnoticed or unchallenged? By the very people who were now speaking out, the community was left to face the uncomfortable truth that its silence had enabled the biases of its members to persist unchecked. In the end, the emotional weight of the day's events settled into the fabric of the town. Some would walk away with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to do better and to demand better. Others would reflect quietly, wondering how many more. Moments like this had passed unnoticed in the past, but for the black family the message was clear. They were worthy of respect, and they would no longer allow anyone to take that from them. They had found their voice, and it had been heard, not just by Karen, but by everyone who had been a part of this transformative moment. It was a victory, but it was just the beginning of the change they would continue to fight for. Obama's intervention in the diner had been a pivotal moment, but its impact went far beyond the immediate confrontation. The words he had spoken, the clarity with which he called out the injustice, resonated deeply with everyone who had witnessed it. What had started as a single act of courage had ignited a fire within the community, one that could not easily be extinguished. As word of the incident spread, it didn't just end with the people in the diner. The town found itself caught in the aftermath of something much larger than a simple act of prejudice. It was a reckoning. Community leaders, who had previously been quiet on issues of racial inequality, began to take notice. Conversations about racism, which had once been quietly avoided or minimized, became a regular topic at town meetings. The issue could no longer be ignored or brushed aside. People could no longer pretend that the inequalities within their town were not part of the fabric of their daily lives. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. Patrons who had been silent during the confrontation began to speak up. One by one, they shared their own stories of discrimination, of witnessing injustice, of having been too afraid or too apathetic to take a stand when it was needed most. There were murmurs of regret for having remained passive, for not addressing the small slights and microaggressions that, when accumulated, became something much larger. As they reflected on the incident, they realized that silence had not been neutrality, it had been complicity, and they weren't willing to let that continue. The Black family, once mere patrons of the diner, had become something more. They were now symbols of resilience and courage, their quiet strength having transformed them into catalysts for change. They had stood up to the injustice they faced, and in doing so, they had ignited a spark of empowerment within the community. Their courage to speak out had not only restored their dignity, but had also paved the way for others to follow their example. The community, which had previously been divided by fear and indifference, was now beginning to unite. The shift was tangible. People who had never once addressed issues of racial bias in their daily lives began to question their own actions and attitudes. The walls of silence that had separated people from their own complicity began to crumble. Small, seemingly insignificant actions, offhand comments, or the failure to intervene were no longer being overlooked. The power of collective responsibility was beginning to take hold. The town was at a crossroads. Would it continue to turn a blind eye to its flaws, or would it confront them head-on and demand change? In the wake of the incident, the town's leadership convened several public forums where the topic of racial prejudice was tackled with honesty and urgency. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes, but the fact that people were talking about it, that they were willing to confront it in the open, was a step forward. In these forums, the Black family shared their experience, recounting how their dignity had been stripped away in a place they had assumed would be welcoming. Their words were measured, but their message was clear. The injustices they had faced were not just isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a much deeper issue. The town was not without its resistance. There were still those who were uncomfortable with the newfound focus on race and privilege. Some insisted that the issue had been exaggerated, that things weren't really as bad as they seemed, but the conversation was no longer a one-sided affair. The voices of those who had long been silent now had the courage to speak, and the conversation was forcing a reckoning that could not be ignored. With Obama's leadership and the strength of the Black family, the community began to rally. The discussions about race, though difficult, became a driving force toward inclusivity. People began pledging to take action against inequality, not just in the abstract, but in their everyday lives. They pledged to challenge their own biases, to be more aware of the ways in which they might unintentionally contribute to systems of oppression. The town, once hesitant to address the uncomfortable truths lurking just beneath the surface, now found itself with an opportunity to transform. In the months that followed, real changes began to take shape. Local organizations sprang up, dedicated to educating people about racial bias, privilege, and the importance of inclusion. Businesses began offering diversity training, and schools integrated more comprehensive discussions on social justice into their curriculums. These were not just fleeting gestures. they were the first steps toward meaningful change. For the Black family, the road ahead was still long, but they walked it with the knowledge that their actions had sparked a transformation, not just in their own lives, but in the lives of countless others. What had begun as a single moment of courage had rippled outward, igniting a broader movement for justice that would continue to grow. And the community, once divided, now stood united in the belief that together they could create a more inclusive, just world. They had confronted their collective silence, and in doing so, had begun to rewrite the future. While the legal system was not immediately involved in the incident at the diner, the lack of formal intervention did not mean that no change was happening. In fact, it was the absence of legal action that allowed a more profound transformation to begin within the community itself. The incident, while deeply painful, became a catalyst for a much-needed reflection on the deeper systemic issues of racism that had been allowed to fester in the town for far too long. The community began to engage in honest dialogues about systemic racism, confronting the uncomfortable truths that many had spent years avoiding. It became clear that the behavior exhibited by Karen, though blatantly obvious, was not an isolated incident. It was a manifestation of ingrained prejudices that permeated the fabric of everyday life, subtly influencing interactions and attitudes in ways that had gone unchecked for years. The lack of legal consequences for Karen's actions served as a reminder that there were no immediate, easy fixes for the issue of racial bias. Yet the absence of immediate legal enforcement also created space for the town to confront these issues head-on, not through the courts, but through a change in mindset and personal responsibility. The realization dawned that many in the community had been complicit in allowing these prejudices to persist, whether through silence, indifference, or unconscious bias. Some patrons, who had been observers in the diner, admitted to feeling uncomfortable but never knowing how to respond, or worse, choosing to say nothing at all. The lack of intervention in that moment, when Karen's subtle discrimination had been so obvious to everyone, was a powerful reminder of how easy it was to remain passive when faced with uncomfortable truths. But now, the community began to understand that this passive complicity had allowed racism to thrive unchecked. Inspired by Obama's intervention, a ripple effect of personal growth and action began to take hold. People who had once been silent began to speak up, challenging not only the biases they had witnessed, but also the ones they had internalized over time. Local organizations, seeing the opportunity to shift the town's cultural attitudes, stepped forward to offer workshops and community programs aimed at educating people about unconscious bias, privilege, and the importance of diversity. These initiatives were not about pointing fingers or assigning blame. They were about fostering understanding and encouraging change. The goal was to create a community where racism, whether overt or subtle, would no longer be tolerated, and where everyone could live with the dignity and respect they deserved. The Black family, empowered by their own experience, became voices in these important conversations. They shared their story, their pain, and their hope with others, helping the community understand the real, personal impact of racism. Their words were not just an echo of the past, they were a call to action for a better future. Through their strength and vulnerability, they reminded everyone that the emotional toll of racism was not only theirs to carry, but was shared by the entire community. Their experience became a catalyst for collective healing. The family's willingness to speak out and the community's growing recognition of its own responsibility led to a shift in collective consciousness. The emotional weight of the incident no longer rested solely on the shoulders of the Black family. It was now a shared burden, one that demanded action and accountability from everyone. The town began the difficult but necessary work of healing, of acknowledging past wrongs and actively working to dismantle the systems that had allowed prejudice to thrive. Obama's intervention had shown the town that change doesn't always require legal action. True transformation begins when people take responsibility for their actions and challenge the status quo. The town, with all its complexities and contradictions, began to realize that it was not enough to passively hope for change. It would take conscious effort, personal growth, and community action to truly create a more just and equitable society. The absence of legal consequences for Karen became a blessing in disguise. It forced the town to look inward, to question its assumptions, and to take responsibility for the biases and systems that had existed for far too long. The real change, as the community began to understand, would come not from the courts, but from within, the collective resolve to confront prejudice and to stand together for a future where dignity and respect were universal. The story of that fateful day in the diner closes with a resounding message, one that lingers long after the events have passed. Change often begins with the smallest acts of courage. Obama's decision to stand up, to confront the uncomfortable injustice unfolding before him, set into motion a series of events that would alter the course of not just the black family's life, but the life of the entire town. What began as a single moment of courage, one man deciding that silence was no longer an option, sparked a chain reaction that would ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. This powerful reminder underscores an essential truth. Societal systems may be vast and entrenched, complicated by history and politics, but individual actions, whether small or large, can disrupt those systems and spark lasting change. It's easy to feel helpless when faced with issues as monumental as systemic racism, to think that as individuals we don't have the power to make a difference. But Obama's intervention and the actions of the black family show us that this is far from true. In fact, it is often the courage of individuals standing up in the face of injustice that becomes the tipping point, the spark that ignites a much-needed transformation. For the black family, what began as a passive observation of injustice became an empowering journey. At first they had sat quietly, not knowing how to respond, unsure of what to do or whether it was worth speaking out. But by the end of that moment, they had found their voice. Their quiet frustration, once confined to the corners of their minds, turned into a powerful statement of defiance against the system that had so often tried to silence them. By standing up, they not only restored their own dignity, but they also gave a voice to others who had long been forced into silence. Their courage inspired those around them to act as well. No longer passive observers, they became symbols of empowerment for the entire community. In the wake of their stand, the town itself began to reconsider what it meant to be an active participant in the fight for justice. The family's resilience ignited something in the hearts of others, an awakening to the reality that each person has a role to play in addressing injustice. No longer were people willing to sit idly by, pretending that they had no power in the face of wrongdoing. They saw that change could be achieved not only through large, sweeping reforms, but through the quiet, individual moments where people choose to stand for what is right, regardless of the consequences. In this context, every small act of courage matters. Whether it's confronting a microaggression, speaking up when someone is treated unfairly, or simply choosing not to be complicit in a system that discriminates, each action builds upon the other. The black family's decision to stand up, supported by Obama's unwavering support, planted a seed. But that seed didn't just grow for them. It grew for everyone who witnessed it, sparking a wider movement for accountability and action. The ripple effects spread beyond the diner and beyond that day, changing the trajectory of the town, and with it, the lives of those who called it home. The story closes with a powerful call to action. Every one of us has a role to play in addressing injustice. There is no such thing as being powerless in the fight against racism. We all have moments in which we can decide to stand up for what is right. The difference between a world where injustice thrives and a world where it is challenged is in the actions we take in those pivotal moments, those moments where our voices can either join the chorus of change or remain silent. The Black family's victory, though hard-won, serves as a reminder that fighting for a just world doesn't always require grand gestures or sweeping reforms. Often the most powerful change comes from small, courageous acts that reverberate far beyond their immediate context. It is these moments, when individuals choose to stand against injustice, to speak out against inequality, that build the foundation for lasting transformation. And when enough people stand up together, they have the power to shift the course of history. This is the legacy of that single act of courage in a quiet diner. A reminder that the fight for justice is not only about addressing the big systemic issues. It is also about empowering individuals to take responsibility for their own actions and to recognize that no act of courage is too small to make a difference. When people choose to act, they begin to create ripples that reach further than they can ever imagine. Every single person who stands up for what is right adds to the collective strength of the community and the world. What begins as one small act of resistance can inspire countless others to follow suit, creating a wave of change that is unstoppable. And that is the true power of standing up against injustice. How can small acts of courage, whether in the face of subtle injustice or overt discrimination, lead to big transformative changes? In what ways can individual actions, no matter how small they may seem, create a ripple effect that inspires others to stand up and take action? How can we as a community work together to challenge the systems that divide us and foster a more inclusive and just society for everyone? What role can each of us play in making lasting change? As we reflect on this powerful story, think about your own life. Have you ever stood up for what's right? It can feel daunting, but your actions matter. Let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, subscribe for more inspiring stories of change and resilience.